Hello, I'm Ryan, and welcome to my channel, Analyze This, Mr. Bond, where I discuss the adventures of James Bond 007 and dig for what lies beneath the surface. Today we're digging into the very strange Never Say Never Again. Never Say Never Again was released in 1983 and featured Sean Connery's return to the role of James Bond after he had bid farewell to the franchise in 1971's Diamonds Are Forever. Never Say Never Again is the unofficial Bond film. It was not officially sanctioned by Eon Productions and was produced due to a series of legal battles over the novel Thunderball. What had happened is that Ian Fleming, when he sat down to write Thunderball, borrowed from some collaborations he had done with another writer, Kevin McClory, and Kevin McClory won the ability to remake Thunderball at some point in the future. He eventually convinced Sean Connery to become a key collaborator and star in the film, and so in 1983, audiences had a battle of the Bonds. There were two Bond films to be released that year. One was Sean Connery's return to the role, Never Say Never Again, and the other was Roger Moore's Octopussy. And so you had an unofficial Bond movie dueling with an official Bond movie. Octopussy won at the box office, and I think in the eyes of many Bond fans is the superior movie. Never Say Never Again remains pretty controversial to this day, but the question remains, is Never Say Never Again worth considering? And I would say it is, if only because it gives us a glimpse of what Bond looks like when you take the Eon Productions machinery away. And what's interesting is that James Bond in this movie feels a little bit more like Bond than Sean Connery did in his last appearance as James Bond in Diamonds Are Forever. Sean Connery appearing in Never Say Never Again is actually a bit more energized. He's certainly much older, and the film doesn't shy away from discussing James Bond's age. In fact, Never Say Never Again positions itself as something of what we now call a legacy sequel. A sequel in which an older version of a hero is kind of brought back to reclaim former glory. Think, for example, Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, or Logan. These are all legacy sequels in which aged versions of these heroes kind of reclaim their mantle in one last big adventure. And that's how Never Say Never Again presents Sean Connery's James Bond. This is an older version of the character who is disconnected from his glory days. But interestingly enough, Sean Connery is actually more fit than he was the last time we saw him, even though it's been over a decade since he was James Bond. He looks better as James Bond here in Never Say Never Again than he did in 1971's Diamonds Are Forever, and he's a bit more energized. He's a bit more connected to the essence of the Sean Connery Bond character. He's having a lot of fun delivering those same kinds of witticisms again. In fact, Sean Connery just oozes charm throughout the whole of Never Say Never Again. And in many ways, the real reason to watch Never Say Never Again, both for us and for audiences in 1983, is just to enjoy seeing Sean Connery in this role again. Now, of course, it's a bit weird to see Sean Connery reenact a film he was already in, though they go to great pains to kind of remix Thunderball into something new, so it doesn't really feel like as much of a remake as it is, even though characters have the same name. Here, there's the villain Largo, the Bond girl Domino, and there's a similar plot with stealing nuclear weapons and holding the world to ransom. However, the set pieces are all very different. They've gone to great lengths to differentiate this film so that it can kind of function as a loose sequel to what audiences remembered as Sean Connery's era. What is really missing, though, and I think this highlights what Eon Productions has always understood about the Bond character, is Bond's darker side. That's no fault of Sean Connery's. He's very engaged in this performance. But the story of Never Say Never Again does not give significant attention to Bond's crueler side, his more violent side. The Eon Productions films, from Dr. No all the way through to No Time to Die, have understood that Bond is fundamentally a killer. Bond was introduced in Dr. No as the kind of character who shoots a guy in the back just to make him feel the pain of dying a little bit more. It was a shocking moment for audiences in 1962, and it defined the Sean Connery Bond character. This was a ruthless character, a character who could be pretty nasty, a tough character. And that edge is largely missing in Never Say Never Again. The story doesn't really give opportunities for the Bond character to go there. Instead, Bond is presented as more of a elder detective adventurer. He is a seasoned veteran of Her Majesty's government, but the idea that Bond functions as an assassin isn't really as central to this movie as it is to the essence of the Eon Productions Bond films. Even Roger Moore's Bond, as warm and tender as he sometimes could be, was a character who was allowed to display fairly ruthless moments. There's not really an equivalent to that in Never Say Never Again. So it feels like something's missing here because Connery's Bond was a rogue and a bit of a brute. And if you watch those movies, which I have done so fairly recently to record my videos on the Connery era, Connery comes off as a pretty savage guy in the Bond role. That edge is mostly missing from Never Say Never Again. That sense of Bond being a blunt instrument really isn't alive in Never Say Never Again. There are other things that keep Never Say Never Again from feeling fully like a Bond movie. It has gorgeous locations and it has some interesting set pieces, but the production team behind it just isn't as good at building a sense of spectacle. Never Say Never Again in general seems to be a little bit lower budget, at least in terms of what they had to film. I'd certainly there were a lot of legal fees over the years and things like that. But it just feels a little bit more intimate than the equivalent Roger Moore movies. And some of that might be budget, and some of that is also just the way things are filmed. There are a lot of gorgeous locations in Never Say Never Again, but they're not filmed with the same level of big screen spectacle that you expect from the Bond movies. There's just not as much of that Bond fantasy coming alive in a visceral way for the audience. That's a failure on part of the filmmakers. This was directed by Irvin Kershner, who famously directed The Empire Strikes Back, but also directed many other things. His filmography is a bit scattered. The sense that you kind of get in this movie is also things are just like a little bit more relaxed than they are in many Bond movies. And the film it's remaking, Thunderball, had a famously pretty slow start. I've talked about that in my Thunderball review, but here things still feel pretty lackadaisical. There's not a sense of urgency around things. The one thing that Thunderball does better than Never Say Never Again is create a sense of stakes around this hijacking of nuclear weapons. In Never Say Never Again, the threat that Spectre has, stolen these nuclear weapons and is holding the world to ransom feels a little bit toothless, and I think it's just in the way that it's presented. There just isn't sufficient gravity given to it, maybe because they felt audiences had already seen it before, so there wasn't as much need to kind of build that up. But it does feel like something's a little bit missing here. There's a little bit of like narrative tension just missing from the get-go that doesn't feel like Bond has a fire driving him to get to the real, bottom of this global crisis. The other thing that kind of doesn't help bring out the best in Connery's Bond here is his relationship with the characters. There are some really great performers in the cast of Never Say Never Again. If the main reason to watch this movie is just to watch Connery recapture some of the charm and energy of his Bond performance, the other reason to watch it is just because so much of the supporting cast is really, really good. Klaus Maria Brandauer as Largo is really one of the series' best Bond villains altogether. The man just oozes this sort of psychotic menace. He is a control freak who has no compunctions about violence. There's just a sort of like simmering rage beneath his calm exterior that is present anytime he's on screen. He's so creepy that he brings such an intense energy to the movie that I wish he was in it more than he is. What he's in is effective, but he could have been given greater material than he is. He's especially good in any scenes with Connery. There's a really good hero villain chemistry between Bond and Largo in Never Say Never Again. Bond, especially being this more mature, measured, rational figure. In fact, the movie goes to great pains to establish how Bond is kind of the voice of reason over at MI6. MI6 is kind of falling apart in the new era where they've kind of lost their way. M is a bit of a moron, and Bond is just trying to kind of get through his work days over there. Bond is presented as the seasoned agent who really knows the score. That sort of maturity plays well off of Largo's sort of manic intensity. He's a little bit more youthful, he's a little bit more chaotic. The two of them have a really good energy, and I enjoy the brief moments they appear on screen together. Unfortunately, they're pit against each other in two major set pieces. One obviously is the climax, which in Never Say Never Again, the climax is one of the weakest parts of the movie. It's just kind of this underwater tussle between Bond and Largo that doesn't really have a lot of dramatic weight. And then their earlier confrontation at the casino in Monte Carlo, where he and Largo play a video game together, essentially. It's a very strange sequence. Bond fans have tended to make fun of this sequence over the years, and I agree it doesn't quite have the glamour or fantasy appeal of Bond just playing cards against the villain the way that has been so satisfyingly done in so many Bond films over the years. But there's something a little bit interesting about how like out there that concept is, because the video game is something that was created by Largo in the universe of this movie. So Largo has essentially created this death trap sort of video game where the more you lose, the more you get electrocuted, and it's very dangerous for your well-being. It's an interesting dynamic, and you can see why they thought it could be a really compelling concept. And I don't think visually it works very well at all. I think what they envisioned a video game to look like in 1983 just feels very antiquated, and it's very hard to understand what's actually going on. It's a kind of unintelligible interface. But the dynamic between Bond and Largo is very successful there. I really kind of like this idea that Bond and Largo are both just kind of trying to outdo each other through their pain tolerance. It's actually a fun idea for a Bond film to play with, and it actually kind of speaks to this interesting dynamic between this film's version of Largo and Sean Connery's Bond, where it's just kind of like they're just gonna outmatch the other through sheer force of will and endurance. Pretty good. And also, they just have sort of a lot of like charming back and forth banter that the movie just doesn't do quite enough with. The other great supporting character in this movie is Fatima Blush. Fatima Blush is sort of this movie's version of the Thunderball Fiona Volpe character. She foreshadows a little bit GoldenEye Xenia Onatopp, in the sense that she is a sort of slightly dominatrix-esque figure where she is just kind of like fixated on men and men's desire for her. There's a sort of like obsession with her being the great idol of every man around her. And so that puts her in a very interesting place with James Bond, and that also puts her in a very interesting place with Largo. We don't get a lot of Fatima Blush and Largo on screen together, but they have a really interesting and strange interaction at the casino where she's really trying to like come on to Largo, and Largo's not really having it, but Largo also is very interested in using her um, murderous tendencies to both kill Bond and potentially eventually kill his own girlfriend, Domino, who he's obsessed with, but kind of seems to understand that his relationship with Domino can't last. And that scene is pretty weird and dark and twisted, and the chemistry between the two of them is really great. They could have been a really striking villain and henchwoman pair if they had more screen time. But she, in her own way, is just a force to be reckoned with in this movie. She just clearly loves murder and mayhem. In one scene, she kills someone just by throwing a snake in their cars. It's such a wild way to murder somebody that it feels perfectly outlandish for a Bond movie. Then she's also like sending Bond down to be killed by radio controlled sharks. And it's this very elaborate and kind of conceptually silly sequence, but it's actually one of the better sequences in the movie in terms of tension. The way they film the sharks underwater is actually really well done. It really feels like there's an actual encounter with dangerous sharks on the screen, which is nicely done. And then her energy with Bond, they're kind of like twisted flirtation leading up to this wonderful moment where Bond finally dispatches her after she tries to get him to like write down a testimony that she was the best lover he ever had. And that whole scene is great. Barbara Carrera is so committed to her performance in this role that it just works like gangbusters. And so I could watch any moment she's on screen in this movie over and over again. Same for Klaus Maria Brandauer as Largo. And there are other supporting turns that are good here too. I really like this movie's version of Q. It's less antagonistic than we're used to in the Eon production Bond films. Bond and Q are really kind of co-conspirators, a bit of the old guard who are kind of suffering under the current moronic MI6 regime. I would say Domino, who's played by Kim Basinger, does not quite come off the way you would really want a lead Bond girl with her sort of dramatic arc to come off in this movie. She is a bit constrained by the way her role is written. There's a interesting dynamic in the sense that she is in a relationship with Largo and seems to have some actual affection for Largo, but is also somewhat terrified of him, and that is an interesting dynamic unto itself. And then there's her relationship with Bond that blossoms, and the revelation that her current lover Largo has actually murdered her brother. That moment happens in the midst of a big tango sequence, which is kind of silly but conceptually kind of interesting. The idea that Bond would have to reveal this to her mid dance is pretty dramatic in a way that feels right for a Bond movie. I don't know that the exact dance that they've picked for Domino and Bond is the right one. Bond performing a very structured, choreographed tango number seems a little bit off. Bond is a improvisational character. I don't believe he's ever had that level of strict dancing lessons and is that performative. I think a more relaxed version of the dance would be appropriate, but the concept is sound, and but it just doesn't give her enough time to really absorb the information that her brother is dead and really let the story build on that. The one thing Thunderball does with Domino's character is that it does give her sufficient time to respond to that information, to process it, and kind of act on her own in a way that gives her some autonomy. Domino does not get that in this movie. She's kind of thrust into a quick damsel in distress role when Largo takes them to Africa, and then is kind of sidelined until she just randomly shows up in the climax in a sequence that just doesn't make a lot of sense, and her relationship with Bond feels pretty shallow. And because it doesn't quite land you just don't get a sense of dramatic satisfaction from the way that these characters' journeys resolve together. The Bond films are not necessarily all character driven, but this film feels like it really should have been a little bit more attentive to the way its characters interact over the course of this movie. There's a lot of potential in these performers being put in this sort of complicated scenario where, you know, there's a lot of like tangled up desire and kind of this weird uh love, not love triangle, but almost like love square, the way their relationships develop, that could have really built into a fascinating climax. And that doesn't really get built on here. Instead, you get a string of set pieces, and this film is really more set piece driven. And the problem with this film being more set piece driven than character driven is the set pieces don't really quite hit the way that they do in the Eon Productions films. The Eon Productions films clearly give their set pieces a lot of thought, especially in this era where every set piece is kind of very colorful and has a lot of imagination behind it, at least to really distinguish it from the rest of the movie so it sticks in your mind. The set pieces in Never Say Never Again are a little bit underwhelming and lack striking visual moments. The opening is a good example of this. The opening equivalent to the pre-title sequence has Bond performing a training exercise. It is all really pretty ho-hum. There's not really a great moment of showmanship there. There's a hand-to-hand combat battle in shrublands that kind of has the same energy as some of like the Indiana Jones fisticuffs. It's Bond versus this big heavy. And some of that is pretty enjoyable, but it just, again, doesn't have that same sort of striking visual element that you would really want to, so that it like sticks in the mind a little bit. It just needed some extra pizzazz. The shark thing I've already complimented a little bit. That's one of the better sequences in this movie. I like that well enough. And I also like the bike chase that's at the center of this movie, but the bike chase itself is hampered by something that is another big problem with this movie, and that is Michel Legrand's score. Michel Legrand was a pretty good choice for composer on paper. He was one of three great composers from the 1960s who were leading the sort of cool jazz sound. One was John Barry, who did the Bond films. One was Henry Mancini, who did the Pink Panther and some other films around that period and developed a really striking jazz sound. Think of like the Peter Gunn theme and things like that. Henry Mancini was a legend, in that time, and so was Michel Legrand. He did the soundtrack for the Thomas Crown Affair. So why wouldn't you want him to score a Bond movie if John Barry wasn't available? He seems like the perfect choice. But the score here is just so messy and weird. Most of the movie is actually left unscored. Watching it this time, I was just struck by how much of the movie unfolds without any sort of background music whatsoever. It's largely just sound effects and dialogue. Every once in a while, Michel Legrand's score pops in, and when it does, it's just so obtrusive and jarring. It's a very harsh score. It doesn't have a sense of rhythm that complements what's going on screen, and so when it accompanies an action sequence, it just kind of tends to suck the energy out of it a little bit. And that's a big problem too for the set piece of the climax, which is just kind of a messy shootout in this ancient temple area. It it doesn't have a lot of shape to it from a choreography or structure perspective, and then the music just comes in and is just feels so at odds with what you're seeing on screen that it kind of sucks the energy out of it. There's a big sense in which so much of the Bond atmosphere depends on music to add that level of grandeur and scope to the events on screen, and that's a big void here in Never Say Never Again. Not just because of Michel Legrand's score, but the theme song also just feels like a really bad attempt to conjure that sort of for your eyes only style romantic ballad. It just doesn't really work as a striking pop song. It doesn't really have a great hook, and the production and vocals on it are just completely off. And so, coupled with somewhat lackluster cinematography, with flat lighting and a sort of lackadaisical approach to the story and set pieces, the film the film just lacks a lot of momentum. I would say in many ways, Never Say Never Again is one of the most boring Bond movies. And that's a sad thing to say about Sean Connery's return to the role. It's a film that doesn't quite work, at least for me. And so, if you're one of its fans, I really want to hear from you in the comments. But I think Never Say Never Again is a bit of a misfire. And it's a shame because there's about, 30 to 40% of a really good Bond adventure in there. It's just the other 60 to 70% that doesn't quite click enough to let the good stuff really take root. So that's my take on Never Say Never Again, and I'll catch you in the next one.